I think the solution is to store the spent fuel in a retrievable fashion where it can be taken back. 100 years from now, we're going to need every energy source that's available to us. And if there's still 80% of the fuel left in the spent fuel, and we can reprocess that into new fuel, why wouldn't we do it? And it is being done elsewhere in the world, like in France today.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Richard Geek podcast. I'm excited to have Scott Melbye on. Scott is the CEO, listen to this, CEO of Uranium Royalty Corp, and he's also their EVP. Scott, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be on with your viewers and listeners today and talk about nuclear energy and how it fits in our energy future going forward.
Yeah, it is exciting. So everybody out there that's listening, this is not the typical type of podcast we've had, which, real estate and syndications investing. This is an informational podcast that I think is extremely important, especially in today's world of, how are we going to live in the next couple hundred years as far as our energy consumptions. Our tech is not going to go away. I have a Tesla. How are we going to power those? It's just the energy consumptions that we need is just expanding. And today we're going to have Scott talk a little bit about why uranium and nuclear power is a very viable option and safe option. So, Scott, 36-year veteran of the nuclear energy industry. So tell us a little bit about your background, what you do.
Yeah, so I have been very fortunate to spend my entire career in uranium and nuclear energy, everything from buying and trading uranium fuel components to buying the uranium fuel for nuclear power plants down in Arizona outside of Phoenix at Palo Verde.
I live near there.
Yeah. And then I have spent much of my career on the mining side, producing uranium and selling uranium to global electric utility companies around the world. And more recently, much more entrepreneurial phase of my career with a small startup, I would say 10, 15 years ago that got into the business of developing uranium deposits in Texas and now in Wyoming to a point where today we're a junior mining company that's grown quite dramatically and is one of the sort of uranium producers in the United States that's poised to really kick up the production and meet the increasing demand. And then we've also started the Uranium Royalty Corp, which is a way for investors to have a diversified portfolio of royalty investments in various uranium operations around the world.
Now, in reading some research, what is your company is the first and only pure play uranium royalty and streaming company. So give me some background on that and why that's important, and what does that mean as far as what does it mean for that uranium type of industry to have this type of concept?
Sure. Well, in the base and precious metals industries, about 10, 15 years ago, this concept of companies based on royalty and streaming. So these are companies that hold financial interests in developing mines, operating mines, but they don't own the mines. They don't have the huge workforce. They don't have the standby costs of keeping the mine down and getting it up and running. But what they have is they get paid a royalty, which is a cash interest when the mine produces, or a stream, which is a physical offtake of the product when the mine produces. And these are companies like Franco-Nevada, silver, wheat and precious metals, Sandstorm, Royal Gold. It's a $50 billion industry. So for investors, it's a way to invest in a commodity, but have diversified risk. You're not putting all your eggs in one mine or one company's mines. For the industry, it's a way for miners and developers to finance the development of their operations, in addition to raising equity through capital raises through equity or through debt through typical bank arrangements. So we're a capital provider to the uranium industry going forward.
Why is uranium so important and nuclear power compared to all of the media? It seems like solar, the wind. Um, Tell us about the importance of uranium and why it might be a more feasible option.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that your audience as tech professionals would appreciate that some of the strongest opinion leaders and just leaders in nuclear energy today come from the tech industry. Bill Gates, Peter Thiel, folks like this that realize how much electricity means to our economy today
Mm-hmm.
with the increased computerization of everything, electrification of our global economy, and certainly with transportation. Elon Musk, I think, is bang on when he says, our electricity demand will increase by at least 50%
Mm-hmm.
if we roll out electric vehicles the way I think we'd all like to see. So, wind and solar are great. There's nothing wrong with renewables. In fact, they have a very important part in the energy mix, but they have limitations. And their biggest limitation is that they only run 25 to 35% of the time at best. So if we're really serious about producing clean energy and moving towards a lower carbon future, we need to figure out what to do with the other 70% of our energy generation. And this is where nuclear fits in very nicely. It's something we've always known in the nuclear energy industry, but it's only been recently that I would say politicians, policymakers, the investment community, even environmentalists have come on board and said, yeah, you know what, nuclear not only can produce clean air, carbon-free energy, but it can do it, with a 95% capacity factor. So we really view ourselves as a perfect complement to renewables, which are more intermittent sources of supply, where we can keep the lights on when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. That's very important. I mean, if you don't go down that path, it's a lot like, Germany went down the green energy path 15 years ago and has spent hundreds of millions of euros on going towards renewable energy, but at the same time phased out their commitment to nuclear power. So in 2021 today, Germany's paying electricity prices 50% higher than neighboring France, which is all nuclear. And they've really done very little to impact their carbon emissions. And if Germany, with that kind of commitment to green energy, hasn't been able to reduce their carbon emissions, they're just burning more Russian gas and dirty lignite coal. Well, what hope does China have or India have? And so we really believe that nuclear, isn't the whole solution to our energy needs going forward, but it's a very important component and fits well in the mix.
Why do you think politicians, people in general, have this adverse, I don't know, adversary thought of nuclear power? It just, for me, it doesn't make sense because being in the military, I saw nuclear power. I was around it. To me, it's extremely clean. It's extremely wonderful. But why do you think, is it just because you're saying it's nuclear? I mean, they just can't get around that word?
I think I think the industry has really done a poor job of promoting ourselves and really getting these strengths across to the public. It doesn't help that, nuclear energy really came out of the nuclear weapons programs of the 1940s. But it was very quickly, I think Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1950 realized that the whole Atoms for Peace movement, that, using fission and uranium and nuclear energy to produce electricity is a very different story than bombs. I mean, in more recent years, we've actually dismantled nuclear weapons in Russia and blended down the uranium and used the fuel to power electricity in cities in the United States. So it's very much these days it's an energy story. But I think we've done a poor job about communicating the safety of nuclear energy. I mean, if you measure fatalities by any energy source we have available today, nuclear is the safest of all energy sources, based on how much, massive amounts of electricity that it produces over time. And its safety record is lower, but is comparable to wind and solar. In terms of its carbon emissions, it's the lowest total system carbon emissions, and it's the only low carbon energy source that produces 24/7 power. Waste is often raised as a major issue. I mean, nuclear energy has actually been the most responsible in dealing with its waste, because we've kept every gram of waste we've ever produced since the 1950s. Instead of pumping it out a smokestack or out a pipeline into a river, we've kept it, and we're going to either store it permanently in a geologic repository that hasn't changed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, or we'll reprocess it into more fuel going forward. And the volume of that waste in the United States would fit on one football field. So I think there's a perception that the waste is just an insurmountable scientific challenge. It's not. It's really political, not scientific. So again, we just need to do a better job of communicating that. I do think, though, that it's clean energy aspects and reliability. We've seen polar vortexes and weather conditions with changing climatary conditions, where extreme winters or hot summers, where 24/7 energy is critical, and even very efficient ways to produce electricity like natural gas, price themselves out of the market, like you saw in Texas during the cold snap there, where consumers were hit with $10,000 electricity bills because so much of that cost of that generation is the fuel, whereas uranium, one runs through hurricanes, heat spells, cold spells, the fuel's on site, like your nuclear reactors in the submarines, they're only refueled intermittently every 18, 24 months in the commercial nuclear case. So they tend to have a lot of strengths that are now in this sort of societal transformation of the way we use and generate electricity is really being appreciated a lot more.
And I think it is important. It's, one of the things that everyone is talking about is the carbon footprint. And I think it's very important to what you were saying, but just how clean. The best thing that you said is there's no smokestacks, right? People don't realize that even with the wind turbines, those blades, when they go bad, they don't, you have to bury them. They don't go away. They will be there 10,000 years from now. You can't recycle those turbine blades. And I think that sometime in the future, this nuclear waste, we're going to have some geniuses out there and say, hey, remember all that nuclear waste? We can actually make it into something and reuse it. Now,
we're actually doing that in France, where they do recycle their fuel. I think, in the United States and elsewhere, uranium is fairly relatively cheap. So we kind of go through that once through cycle where I think the solution is to store the spent fuel in a retrievable fashion where it can be taken back. 100 years from now, we're going to need every energy source that's available to us. And if there's still 80% of the fuel left in the spent fuel, and we can reprocess that into new fuel, why wouldn't we do it? And it is being done elsewhere in the world, like in France today.
What exactly is uranium? And when it, I know it has a part to do with nuclear fuel, or what is uranium?
So uranium is one of the most commonly found elements in the earth, which surprises people. It's in sandstone deposits. It's in hard rock deposits. In order to be a commercially viable deposit that turns into a mine, you've got to find that uranium in concentrated levels that justify the cost of mining it and processing it. But it is a metal. It's an energy metal which is mined and then basically producing a yellow cake or uranium concentrates, which is converted into a gas, and then the gas is spun in a centrifuge to separate the U-235 isotopes from the other isotopes which are not fissionable, and you get uranium which is enriched to a level of about 5%, which can then sustain a reaction. A reactor basically boils water and spins a turbine. So that's very different than nuclear weapons, which are at an enrichment level of 97% or in that range. So again, it's an energy mineral that is mined. In the United States, we have probably 1 billion pounds of known and likely resources across the Western United States. Canada is a major producer, Kazakhstan, Australia, Southern Africa, Central Africa. So it's quite available. I mean, we could sustain nuclear power for many hundreds of years with the known resources we have. It's not something that we're going to run out of quickly, because that's obviously a concern in the sustainability of nuclear power.
Do you see anything else as far as with nuclear power? Are we going to see not just with taking over as far as powering things, as far as homes and buildings and submarines? Is there any other type of market that you see that uranium and nuclear energy may be used? And I'm thinking maybe airplanes, or it's other things that.
Yeah. So clearly space travel, where we are using nuclear powered rockets, and once we get to Mars or wherever we set up bases, you've got to be able to produce electricity more sustainably than you might be able to get from just the typical traditional solar panels. We're using nuclear power to produce hydrogen, which is very important for transportation and clean energy options going forward. Desalination of water is incredibly energy intensive, but critical in places where they just lack the clean water resources like we have here in the United States, the Middle East, for example. So we see incredible applications. Well, obviously the medical has always been important in cancer treatments, diagnosis, treatment of cancer. And another one that's really interesting was announced today, that Energy Harbor, that operates nuclear power plants in Ohio, is co-siting in support of cryptocurrency mining, because we're, the discussion of, okay, cryptos are great, but how are they produced? Are they produced in an environmentally friendly manner, or are they not? And so citing cryptocurrency mining next to clean energy nuclear power plants, is another application. So I think just going forward, I mean, you're seeing companies, whether it's Amazon or Google, commit to carbon-free energy, or big mining companies. Newmont, the world's largest gold company located in Denver, where I am, has committed to a 30% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Well, that's a tall order. And I think it's one thing, and I'm not against it, but I mean, a lot of these carbon-free targets are being met by offsets. They're still relying on fossil fueled energy to meet some of their needs, but they're offsetting that with investments in mangrove swamps in Brazil, or planting forests somewhere else in the world. That's fine. That is a legitimate offset. But at some point, we need to figure out how to deliver the electricity in a carbon-free manner, so a company can be not just net zero, but from a gross perspective, achieving that. And so we're seeing nuclear power being adopted in micro reactors for mining operations, whether it's in Northern Ontario or Quebec or Northwest Territories. Who knows, maybe amongst the gold mines in Nevada, you would have a micro or a small modular reactor that provides carbon-free energy, not just intermittently, which is very hard to run a factory or a mine on intermittent energy, but can run 24/7 in a clean manner. The small modular reactors are something too that are really the next stage, where small modular reactor means a reactor that's 50 or 100 megawatts, not 1,500. It can be built for hundreds of millions, not billions of dollars. It can be built on a scalable manner, where you can build 1, 2, 3 segments at a time and build your way up to a significant capacity. So they're great for remote locations, island locations, grids that are heavily burdened by renewable power. That intermittency causes grid operators real headaches trying to meet demand with something that's not running all the time. So small modular reactors have a place. I was very fortunate to attend the announcement about 5 weeks ago in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where Bill Gates' company TerraPower out of Washington State is selling a reactor to his bridge buddy, Warren Buffett, who owns Pacific Corp, and Rocky Mountain Energy owns the utility company in Wyoming, where they're buying one of these 300 megawatt advanced reactors, siting it on the location of a retiring coal-fired plant. I don't care which side of the political spectrum you're on, this just touches all the buttons. It employs people that, did rely on that coal industry, which is so important in coal country. And if we're going to phase coal out, we've got to give them viable alternatives to live and sustain themselves in those communities. So siting a nuclear power plant where a lot of the skills that they learned at the coal-fired plant are transferable. So, we're seeing that next wave of reactors with small, modular, and advanced reactors. You're still seeing big reactors built around the world in China, India, where they have big baseload needs. We've added 56 reactors to the grid globally in the last 8 years, another 51 under construction. So it really is a growth story. And, where I come in the uranium side of the business is, we've underinvested in the uranium mining and development around the world for the last 8 to 10 years. And so investments in being able to supply uranium to meet this increasing demand for nuclear energy is where my two companies are really positioned.
Mm-hmm. Now, how small do you think these reactors can get? Is this something that can be, you think we'll get to where it's mobile, that we can, disaster areas go in and do you see that in the future?
Absolutely. One of the applications that's really being advanced right now is through the Defense Department, and it's called Project Pele. And it was interesting for me to learn that in all of our military interventions in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, our highest number of casualties has come from the logistical supply lines to those bases. And the largest consumable at those bases is diesel oil to keep the power running at those forward combat bases. So the U.S. Defense Department has realized, okay, we've got to reduce the casualties and reduce the number of convoys through these dangerous areas. So they developed micro reactors which fit in the size of a shipping container. They're shipped on site and can provide power without having to continually supply it with tanker truckloads of diesel oil. So, that is being developed. That same technology can be used in mining operations, remote locations, islands. It is being used in space travel and in rockets where you need a lot of energy in a small package. Whether it goes to vehicles, I think the better use for nuclear power in transportation is through the generation of electricity that goes into electric vehicles. If we're fueling your Tesla with coal-fired power plant, okay, it's great. You don't have the emissions from your tailpipe, but there's a coal-fired plant somewhere that still is. And if we can move towards a greater carbon-free contribution to the fueling of electric vehicles, we've really achieved something.
Yeah, that's, this has been extremely, I don't even know how to put it. It's something that you don't think about. And, I'm so glad that you came on because I have heard Elon say that, look, we don't have enough electricity to do what these administrations, these government people want. They just say, do it. And the real geniuses behind the products are like going, not unless you create something, more.
This is the big challenge. The way we use and generate electricity is determined by three things: public policy, consumer preference, and then the technological aspects. And a lot of what's been happening lately has been driven by the public policy and the consumer preference. Yeah. But the rubber hits the road when it comes to technology, how much energy we're actually going to need, and the way you generate that. We can't just wave a magic wand and get all the carbon-free power that we want and need. Not to pick on California, your neighbor there to the west.
Oh, you can pick on them. That's fine.
California wants to go to the sale of all electric vehicles by 2030 or 35.
Yeah.
Yet today cannot reliably supply electricity to homes and businesses in 2021. So we really got to deal with this, and this is why folks like Bill Gates and Peter Thiel are all over this, because they've done the math, they've done the science, and if we really want to be serious about carbon reduction or even just clean air energy, you don't have to be a climate change warrior to love nuclear power, because if you're a kid growing up in Mumbai or Delhi or Beijing and you can't go out and play for several days straight because of the pollution issues from coal-fired power plants. Well, I would argue that's probably more important to them than 1 or 2 degree change in global temperatures.
Yeah,
They're important, but we can address both of them with nuclear.
I think it's so funny. You're hitting on these climate change activists, and I think 50% of them love nuclear, 50% of them or hate it, whether it's due to misconceptions or not. And then how hard is it with ever-changing policies, every potential someone new in the White House every 4 years? How hard is it to continue to push what you want to do with these ever-changing? All right, here you go, you've got 4 years of let's do it, let's and then someone else comes in and, oh my God, nuclear, we're going to kill everyone.
Well, Mike, the problem is like energy issues are not 4-year problems or 4-year challenges. They're 10 and 100-year challenges, and they don't fit well in an election cycle, especially when you're swinging back and forth more frequently. So that is a critical step. I mean, but public policy is one thing, consumer preference is the other. I'll give an example during the Trump administration, where I would say the phase out of coal-fired power generation was slowed under his administration. There were no electric utility companies in the United States that went out and said, "Oh, now's my opportunity to go out and build a coal-fired power plant." I think in some cases, public policy's out front, and in other areas, consumer preference gets out ahead of public policy. And I think with greener energy, cleaner energy, the public's demanding it no matter who's in the White House. Now, you have to do it wisely and smartly, and there may be parts of the world or even parts of the United States where you're going to need a component of coal, because, I mean, where I live in Colorado, we're 50-60% coal. You do without that, we're going to have reliability issues and cost issues to deliver electricity. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be transitioning to cleaner energy, and nuclear certainly can fit that bill. And you did mention public opinion, and for much of my career, nuclear has been a 50-50 sort of public acceptance situation where either people love it or they hate it. Today, in light of cleaner energy needs and demands from society, we're now seeing a 76% approval rating, if you will, for nuclear energy as part of the solution going forward. So that's going to make it a lot easier for politicians and decision makers to get behind and support. I had the opportunity, the real privilege, to testify for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee a month before last, and speak to regaining America's leadership in nuclear energy, both here and abroad. And 10, 15 years ago, that would have been a very contentious setting. Not saying I'd be like Martin Shkreli coming in and testifying on behalf of pharma, or Jack Dorsey defending on public privacy issues, but I would have had the Democratic senators really use it as an opportunity to just go after nuclear power and try to tear it down. That was not the case, and is not the case presently back on Capitol Hill, where even former opponents of nuclear power have either quieted or kind of stifled their rhetoric and opposition towards nuclear power. And other Democrats like Joe Manchin are absolutely 100% on board with it because of what it can provide the country. And so it's one of the few things that is truly bipartisan in nature back in DC these days. So I feel quite fortunate to be in that position, because this energy revolution that we're going, I mean, there are winners and losers, and it's, not, being in a state that depends heavily on the oil and gas industry in Colorado. I mean, the boots are being put to fossil fuels, and that's a very difficult transition for them. So, we're going to have to figure out how to balance all these interests. But I know nuclear energy today, is about as bipartisan in support as you can get.
Yeah, and the important thing is to remember that you can't get rid of coal 100%, because it's used in other types of manufacturing. It's in things that we build. It's in, it's not just an energy thing. So we have to go side by side, and maybe we use a lot less of the coal for the energy part.
Mhm.
But, I don't see, unless we can create things differently, coal's not really going to.
Well, we need coal to make steel. That's pretty important.
Yeah,
That's there are ways to do carbon sequestration and advances in sequestering the carbon emissions from coal. So we need to be, America's blessed with many energy alternatives. We should be using the best use of everything we've got at our disposal.
What do you see the future that we haven't talked about? Are we going to have our own little household reactors? They're going to be, what do you see if you had your wish? Where do you see nuclear power?
Yeah, I think that much decentralization in nuclear is probably not the best efficient use. Frankly, solar is a better decentralized, for placing something on your home or your roof. But I do see nuclear, whether it's the 1,600 megawatt units that are powering major cities and economies, or these small modular reactors that are backing up renewables and part of the mix. I think that really gives us, again, if your tech audience knows that, we're going to be using more electricity, not less. I've never seen an economy in the history of mankind grow on using less energy. It's more energy. And we shouldn't be afraid to use more energy. We're always told, oh, conserve energy. But what if we can produce it cleanly? What if we can produce it abundantly, and that drives, our economy? Why shouldn't we use more of it? And I think that's where we've got to, continue to innovate and make advances in all energy technologies to really deliver that promise.
Well, I love the fact that if we could get to the point where we can use nuclear power for emergency situations, third world countries, even within the United States. You look at the Navajo Nation here in Arizona, and you look at some of the tribal lands and some people, they're rolling blackouts. They have really big issues with electricity and other people and it doesn't have to really be a third world country. There are people in places where, my God, if you could just roll in this smaller reactor, and then even if it's temporary, and especially when the hurricanes and disasters happen, wow, I don't know how that works. I'm not that smart, but I know that it sounds wonderful.
We have done that on a small scale with the U.S. Navy, where I think it was in Haiti after the earthquake, where they did dock the aircraft carrier and reverse the transmission. So they were actually providing electricity from the reactors on board, to the grid. The Russians are developing floating reactors that are essentially the same thing, providing electricity in the remote Siberian region. So there's a lot of innovative applications we can use, but it's all about delivering clean, reliable energy.
Well, Scott, I could go on for probably another hour or so, but this has been wonderful. How can I think you've piqued my interest. I know you're going to pique our listeners' interest. How can people learn more about what you do and about uranium and nuclear?
Yeah. Listen, I think if you're interested in nuclear energy and just the whole broader picture, I would go to the World Nuclear Association out of London, go on their website, go to the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is our nuclear industry organization in DC. My companies, Uranium Royalty Corp and Uranium Energy Corp, on their websites, you can see what we do in terms of supplying and financing the development of new uranium mines. And that's a way to invest in this green energy story. The ESG investing and clean investing has become such a huge thing, very real. And it's certainly boosting our industry, where we're seeing funds that have already invested heavily in wind and solar and battery companies, and to be able to invest in uranium, is for them as an additional new industry. for them to support with clean investments. So I would encourage your listeners, if green investing in nuclear energy is of interest, uraniumenergycorp.com and uraniumroyalty.com are two ways to have a direct investment in cleaner energy.
Wonderful. Well, Scott, I thank you very much for coming on and enlightening us about this, this wonderful project that I think is the future of the world. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure. Take care.
Take care.